Jack and Alex.
Who's the first speaker on that?
Jack.
And who's first speaker for Congress?
Brian. Is everybody ready? James and I negate resolved on balance the current authorization for use of military force gives too much power to the president. Our sole contention is a fragile victory. Despite significant progress against ISIS in Iraq and Syria, our victory is far from assured. Paul McCleary of Foreign Policy magazine writes that a hardcore remnant of about 6,500 Islamic State fighters remain in eastern Syria. Alarmingly, Patrick Johnson of Foreign Affairs reports that these fighters, coupled with the foreign fighters returning from other ISIS deployments, could resurrect the caliphate. In fact, he concludes that ISIS has been planning a resurrection since 2016. In light of the fragile situation, our new strategy in the Levant is to create an enduring presence. Unfortunately, Congress has taken a policy of inaction. Russell Berman of The Atlantic explains that despite a decade of mounting casualties, Congress has repeatedly refused to debate ISIS intervention because they are too afraid of the political consequences of authorizing a new conflict. Instead, presidents have waged the war against terrorism. E.B. Crunden of Think Progress explains that both Obama and Trump have used the authorization for use of military force as the legal justification for ISIS intervention. Luis Martinez of ABC News confirms that the U.S. is realigning 5,600 troops in Iraq towards consolidating the gains made against ISIS, helping the Iraqi government hold the line against an ISIS resurgence. Our continued presence prevents a resurgence in 4 ways, and the first is by cutting off recruitment. Rehan Salam of Slate magazine writes that many Sunnis have joined ISIS out of fear of oppression by the Iraqi government, but most of Iraq's Sunnis are willing to lay down their arms if they are promised the rights to live in peace only because U.S. forces would keep Shia sectarianism in check. Historically, Hal Brands of the Institute for Strategic Studies explains that the U.S. presence in Iraq served to reassure the government, promoting minority inclusion and reducing sectarianism. As soon as the U.S. withdrew in 2011, the government began repressing Sunni rights and cracking down on Sunni politicians. The consequences were dire, as Alice Fordham of NPR reports that Iraq's protest crackdowns after our withdrawal drew many Sunnis towards ISIS, fueling their rise. Second is by providing logistical support. Without the U.S., the Iraqi front would collapse. Brands of the ISS writes that when the U.S. withdrew in 2011, a near total breakdown of Iraqi logistics resulted in key units having insufficient supplies such as water, food, and ammunition, badly depressing morale, and almost ensuring that such units would simply collapse when confronted by ISIS. Fortunately, Michael Schmidt of the New York Times reports that U.S. service members who specialize in logistics and training are on the ground supporting the Iraqis, ensuring that progress against ISIS continues. Further, Jim Michaels of USA Today confirms that the continued U.S. troop presence trains Iraqi forces and helps with intelligence and surveillance, stabilizing the region for the long term and preventing a power vacuum once our conflict ends. Third is by leading the coalition. The U.S. State Department explains that the U.S. leads a 75-country coalition in the fight against ISIS, providing strategic leadership and centralized decision-making. Strong coalitions suppress the strength of terrorist groups. Raymond Cooperman of the Journal of Peace Research confirms that during times of high U.S. pressure, violent groups conduct 210% fewer attacks. Removing the U.S. from the conflict would threaten a breakup of the coalition, emboldening terrorists around the globe. Fourth is by conducting airstrikes. John Wanger of Newsweek reports that the U.S. leads bombing strike efforts against ISIS and have conducted almost 25,000 strikes since the beginning of our intervention. These airstrikes go a long way towards bringing ISIS down. As Nicola Fideli of the University of Glasgow explains that the strikes have taken out key ISIS strongholds and oil production. I don't know what's wrong with the timer, I still have time. As a result, the Washington Examiner finds that ISIS has lost 98% of the land it once held. Preventing an ISIS resurgence is incredibly important, as Alistair Jamieson of NBC News finds that in just 2 years, ISIS killed over 18,000 civilians and displaced 3.2 million people. Thus, we negate.
Whoever that is, shut it off.
No, I'm sorry, it's mine.
Oh, no, sorry.
Sorry about that.
Certainly. We affirm resolve. Our sole observation is that the war on terror is failing. Brooks of Foreign Policy finds that decades of military whack-a-mole have only increased the terror rate. The Guardian quantifies a 5-fold increase in terror fatalities since 9/11. For all, the Cato Institute explains that the American strategy has destabilized the Middle East while doing little to protect the United States from terrorism. Our sole contention is that the AUMF gives far too much power to the president because it is unconstitutional. When the Constitution was ratified, it ruled that Congress declares war, and while the president has the power to be the commander of the army, it means nothing more than the direction of military Navy forces. While the original purpose of the AUMF was to carry out attacks specifically against the perpetrators of 9/11 attacks, meaning Al-Qaeda, it is branched off to something far more disturbing, in which the president has the power to wage constant war. Nicholas of the Nation furthers in 2017 that the AUMF is the reason we've allowed the war in Afghanistan to become America's longest war. This perpetual war is continued through the AUMF, most prevalently in 2 different areas. The first is the usage of drones. The AUMF allows the President of the United States to carry out drone strikes without any congressional approval, a strict violation of his constitutional abilities, and therefore a clear example of his surplus power. Kate Martin, director of the Center for National Security Studies, finds that all United States drone strikes in 2009 have been authorized by the AUMF, and the Trump presidency has expanded drone strikes by 400%. Helene Bennett, the Washington Diplomat, furthers that there is a slippery slope of presidents relying on the AUMF to combat all forms of terrorism. Not only are drones a clear violation of his constitutional powers, but they are horrible and are getting much worse. As Savage, the New York Times found that the Trump administration removed limitations from the drone program so that they no longer have to target only high-level targets and no longer need to undergo high-level vetting. Whatever limited oversight in drone usage there once was is now disappearing. Therefore, the usage of drones under the AUMF is not only a clear surplus of power, but results in 3 negative impacts. The first is civilian lives. Drones are inaccurate. According to Michael Zenko of Foreign Policy, the use of drones led to 35 times more civilian fatalities than utilization of conventional air tactics. The Pentagon expounds that only 2% of drone-related fatalities kill terrorists, with the other 98% killing civilians. Second is increasing terrorism. Joe Becker of the New York Times has determined that drone strikes have replaced Guantanamo Bay as the primary way to recruit terrorists. Moreover, PBS explained that through their apparent slaughter of innocents, drones have radicalized a new generation of insurgents to fight against America. That's why Admiral Mike Mullen concludes that drone strikes are more harmful to stopping terrorism than helpful. Yeager of the Institute of Labor Economics quantifies that following a drone strike, a retaliatory terrorist attack is 8.8% more likely. Further supporting our stance with U.S. allies, Amnesty International finds that the brutality of drone strikes further distances the U.S. from many Middle Eastern countries. This is crucial as the Brookings Institute finds that the U.S. cannot successfully fight terrorism without the use of their Middle Eastern allies due to their information and control over resources in the area. The second way the perpetual war continues through AUMF is a disincentivization of diplomacy. The ability for the president to attack terrorists with little to no congressional oversight has turned the United States away from diplomacy in favor of swift action. Indeed, Penny of the National Public Radio explains that for the past decade, U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East has focused on military action. Nile of Foreign Affairs concludes that when the U.S. possesses a greater combative ability, they move away from the diplomatic table. Meaning, since the executive branch has been able to do what they want whenever they want to, they've avoided trying to negotiate. That's why Maloney of the Washington Examiner explains that the AUMF stands in the way for a diplomatic shift in foreign policy. The impact is terrorism. Judd of NYU finds that soft power and diplomacy are crucial to fighting terrorism. Jedler of GMU empirically confirms that soft power ends terrorist groups 43% of the time, and the military force is the least effective method in stifling terror groups, only working 7% of the time. The AUMF is the only barrier to conversation. Thus we affirm. Thus have the cost. was 14 years.
No, I thought it sounded like over there.
Is everybody ready?
One sec.
Yes. How long do drone campaigns last?
Well, we've had drones in the Middle East for like 2 decades.
No, I'm
so
saying
let's
a
move on
single.
to.
No, wait, that's not responsive
You're
to
asking
my
me a
question. That's not responsive to my question.
Okay, what are
A
you looking
single
for?
drone campaign. How long does it last?
What do you mean?
When I fly a bunch of drones over a country.
So I think you're going to be getting at the fact that like we view people for like 79 days and 69 hours. 64
That's
hours
not
before.
at all what I'm
Oh, what are you
getting
getting at then?
How long does a drone campaign last?
I don't know that.
A couple of days.
Okay, cool.
That's fine.
Okay, let's move on to like this resurrection point. You talk about how like as a result of like U.S. intervention, we've been like fighting terror and done a really good job. What we show you is that 95% of the terror.
Is there a question involved here?
It will be at the end if you let me finish.
Okay.
If you look at what's actually been happening in the Middle East, 95% of retaliatory terror attacks against the U.S. have been as a result of intervention.
So is this a response or a question?
So how therefore is the U.S. having presence in that area doing anything to combat terrorism other than increasing recruitment?
I'm going to respond to your question with a question of my own. When we intervene, do we generally intervene in escalating conflicts or in peaceful regions?
I've heard this one a lot. It really doesn't matter.
Yeah, it does.
No, it doesn't. We
Because
intervene in
hold
different
on,
situations
if we
across the
intervene
world.
in a war zone and the war continues, that doesn't mean the war continues.
I get what
because
you're
of
getting
us.
at. You're saying that like, oh, the U.S. didn't need to be there. We still would have had like this increase in terrorism. That's not true. Because if you look at what's fueling these terrorists the most, it's the U.S. presence.
No.
As a result, the 95%.
There is no study that can isolate for why people are joining terrorist groups. The
Arslan.
only thing that
Arslan.
a study. Wait, you can't ask, like, you can't, like, go to Syria and, like, poll ISIS fighters as to why they're joining terrorist groups. Like, the only thing that your study isolates for is what happens before and after a U.S. intervention.
So then how
it doesn't isolate causality. I'm going to respond to your question
are you asking
right
the
now.
Sunnis then why they're invading, why they're like increasing recruitment in Iraq? Because you said the Sunnis
I
are feeling
absolutely
oppression
am.
from Pakistan.
I
So then we can do the
absolutely
same
am,
thing
because
with you.
no. Sunni party leaders have said that they feel isolated from the Shia
Okay, well then
government because of sectarian policies.
let's look at like
Now,
terrorist group leaders who are saying the U.S. is the reason they're attacking, the U.S. presence in that area.
Of course,
so that answers your own question.
Hold on. Of course, terrorist group leaders don't want the U.S. there because they're losing to the U.S.
Okay.
Okay? So I would say that overall,
Well,
you
no,
cannot
I would
isolate.
actually contest that. I would actually contest that.
So
I'd
terrorist
say that-
groups want us there?
I'd say the majority of
They
terror
like
groups,
losing?
they actually like us there because they can then use a victim mentality and say like there's a large fight
so
from
when
the
ISIS lost 98%, hold on. When
Okay.
ISIS lost 98% of their land to us, and they lost 20,000 fighters, they like it when 20,000 fighters die. They
That
like it when
addresses-
their recruitment
that does not
decreases,
address
and
the
they like
root
it when
cause
they
of
lose
terrorism.
98%
That does
of their
nothing
land.
to address the root cause of terrorism. The root cause of terrorism
You are
is
not
how much.
talking about the root
Okay,
cause of
do you want-
terrorism.
do you want to talk
I
or do you want
already
my
told you.
answers?
I already
Okay.
told you that your study cannot isolate for the reason
But
why
yours can.
people are
But
joining
yours can,
terrorist
right?
groups. I am saying no.
Uh-huh.
The reason
But
that
the
mine
Sunnis in
can is because
Iraq-
it's not a study.
Uh-huh.
It's not a study. It's Sunni party leaders saying
And
that
we're
they
looking
feel
at
oppressed
Iraq.
by the Shia
This is a
government.
circle. We've already gone here. But more importantly, you're talking about the fact.
No, this is not a circle because
We
in
already
order
went
for a
over this.
circle to happen, you need to close it. And you haven't responded to me.
Okay, then this is just a continuing like circular motion. Okay, let's go for that. But more importantly, the problem here is that U.S. intervention causes a terror group, not like this oppression.
It doesn't. I don't
And yours
accept your
also
premise.
only specifies for Iraq. They
It
talk about the
doesn't.
entire
I
Middle
don't
East.
accept your presence.
I don't accept your premise.
Damn. Dude, I feel like that's actually way to go, man.
Is everyone ready? Starting on their case, they give you a framework that the war on terror has failed. Like Brian tells you, their studies are generally reverse causal. Why is this logically sound? Because America doesn't intervene in areas that are peaceful. We intervene in rising conflict. So consequently, obviously they can point to statistics that say after we intervene, conflict got worse, terrorism got worse. That's because these terrorist groups were getting stronger before we intervened in the first place. They don't isolate for causality. We say insofar as we reduced ISIS's land by 98%, insofar as we killed 20,000 militants, we are winning this war against ISIS. But then specifically on their contention one, on unconstitutionality. The first part of this convention says that Congress holds the power to declare and wage war. That is simply not true. First of all, you can look to CNN in 2015. What they tell you is that Congress was given the opportunity to repeal and review the AUMF. They said it was still relevant. Why? Because ISIS is a huge threat. In fact, what the AUMF does is it is a transfer of war-making authority from Congress to the President. That's why the Supreme Court ruled in 2007 that it was constitutional by accepting an appellate court decision. So, either way, the Supreme Court thinks it's constitutional, it probably is. But even then, on their specific impacts. First, on drones. We would say this argument is entirely non-unique. The reason why is because drone campaigns tend to only last a few days. You fly the drone out, it hits its target, and then the campaign is done. The reason why that's an issue is because the War Powers Act allows the president infinite latitude on any intervention under 60 days. That's to say the president can strike no matter who he wants. However, specifically with long-term interventions like the war we are waging against ISIS, a decade-long war, you need an AUMF, an authorization for use of force. So that's why we tell you, interventions like ISIS are unique to this resolution. However, drone strikes are going to be occurring no matter which team we vote for, so you can completely drop their contention right now. So, moreover, they give you a few impacts. First, they speak of civilian lives. We would say that might have been true of the old strategy. However, Brookings indicates the new strategy is called leadership decapitation, where we don't just target random terrorists, we specifically target the leader of terrorist groups. That's why they tell you the new rate of civilian casualty has fallen down to 1.5%, while we're also doing a good job of shutting these groups down. That brings me to their second word on increasing terrorism. In fact, this strategy of leadership decapitation has worked. George Mason University finds that historically, when a leader is taken out of a terrorist group, they are 27% more likely to fail in the long term because they don't have the logistical know-how of their leader. That's why we've seen ISIS has lost so many members. But moreover, we would say, according to Al Jazeera, the reason why terrorists are able to recruit so many people is because they have a narrative of religious invincibility. ISIS says that because of their Quran, they're never going to lose a battle. That's why they're able to recruit so many people. Consequently, we tell you if we break this myth of invincibility, if we bring ISIS to the ground, destroy 20,000 militants and reduce territory by 98%, we reduce recruitment. That's why their numbers are at an all-time low. But then moreover, we would tell you we can turn this argument against my opponents because if terrorists are hiding in caves away from drone strikes, they're probably not doing a very good job going into the public and recruiting people. Then, on their argument about Middle Eastern allies, I would say this argument doesn't make much sense because we are in a coalition with the Middle East where they do airstrikes with us, drone strikes with us, and troop training with us. Obviously, they are on our side when it comes to striking down ISIS. Nobody wants ISIS to grow. Then, under contention 2 on diplomacy, a few responses here. First, and most importantly, America isn't going to fundamentally shift their strategy away from warfare just because there is no AUMF. This wasn't true before 2001 when the AUMF was passed. We know America still used interventions. They used it under the War Powers Act. In fact, this means that interventions are going to be blippy. They're going to be around 60 days or less. However, this strategy is much worse than our current strategy of long-termism. The reason why is because we go in, we take out leaders, but then we leave immediately, creating a power vacuum where other terrorist groups fight to reclaim power. That's what led to the creation of ISIS. They are calling for a new terrorist group to rise up. But moreover, on this diplomacy argument specifically, we would say that terrorist groups only come to the table at the point in which you reduce their power enough they want to negotiate. That means military force is a prerequisite. Then, finally, they give this idea, they assert that 43% of terrorist groups are ended with political remediation. But they don't tell you what this actually means. What this actually means is telling terrorists to lay down their guns and run in a political party. And this is horrible. We can see this happening in Palestine with Hamas. When terrorist groups and bad ideologies gain power, we see things like Nazism gain power. We see mass genocides, and that's a bad thing. We urge you to vote for the negative team.
Before his rebuttal, will we see just the 1.5% for civilians?
Yeah.
And then, Can we also see the appellate court?
Yeah. We'll show you one at a time.
Yeah, that works.
Here's 1.5%.
Sounds good. I'm starting prep now.
Okay, so pausing the graph, 11. I'm going to close that stop for you. Okay, here's decapitation leads to death.
Oh, and I'm starting prep now.
Okay, I'm at 17 total?
Yeah.
Our clock has the previous.
Okay, cool.
Oh, just the appellate court too.
Yeah. It's al-Bahani versus Obama. I can show you each individual exception.
Whatever you're using to say that.
Yeah. This is the biggest one.
Okay.
It's an intention to fight against the United States.
And we're starting prep now.
There's like 6. I can show you that. Or you just scroll down. Stay listening.
Okay. So, are you okay?
There's more.
Whatever else you have.
It's maybe follow that one, but sure.
Here's closest listener.
Cool. Starting. Yep. Thanks.
Here's identification with enemy
Do you guys need to
forces.
see all these? No.
Whatever you're using.
This is
It's all
that's
of
all.
them, yeah.
It's just
Okay. Actually, you know what?
bunch
That's
of
all.
them.
That's
Okay.
perfect.
How much prep have you all used?
We have a minute 22 left.
So you guys don't want to see the other ones?
No.
We'll run a bit.
We have a minute left.
Let's start with the framework, right? The debate today is not whether or not an alternative is equal to or like greater than the AUMF. It's whether or not the AUMF specifically grants the president too much power specifically. So at the point where they're trying to non-unique our first argument, that's still a reason to vote for us because it shows that the AUMF specifically right now is enabling drones and drones are bad. But then let's go into their case, right? Start with their entire contention. The problem here is that they try to the only link out where they're saying that Congress is not going to act is that they claim Congress is too scared to do so. But the problem behind this is that even if the president is doing so through the AUMF, Congress has to fund him, which means that in the end, Congress is still complicit in these acts. And the reason behind that is that we tell you the United States can, even if we didn't have the AUMF, the United States would still be pushed forward to take part in this intervention, right? Because what we show you is that the president and Congress both want more airstrikes in ISIS. They both want to intervention, right? We show you through the Hill that there's a 73% popularity among American citizens to intervene against ISIS. At the point where the American citizens want to do so, the politicians that they elect are going to support that sentiment. We're going to see this intervention in either world. But furthermore, realize that means that under the AUMF, Congress is completely complicit. They're going to pay for it in either way. This is not something specific to the AUMF. It's not a power granted to the president through the AUMF. That's how we non-unique it and link it to our side. Because we tell you through our world, with the AUMF is granting too much power in this situation because it's not specific to healing. It's not specific to healing the problems of ISIS. We tell you specifically that this, at the bottom, their fourth warrant really talking about airstrikes and decreasing land growth by 98%. The problem behind this card is it only tells you that 98% of land once held by ISIS has now been taken away. It doesn't account for ISIS growth in other areas. It doesn't account for ISIS growth on media and recruitment and other sources. What we tell you is that when you actually see land lost, you see that these groups increase in resoluteness, they increase in recruitment. That's how you link back into our case, where we tell you drone strikes and other methods directly linking to the AUMF are the reason for terrorist growth overall. So let's go back to my case. Starting on the contention one, right? Their entire, starting with the constitutionality, their point here is a link to this Supreme Court acts. The problem with Supreme Courts are they were trying to rule on the Guantanamo Bay legality. None of this is directly to the AUMF and whether or not we're allowed to use force in other countries. So go on to the first point about drone usage. What they try to tell you is that these campaigns are for a few days, and so that's why the War Powers Act is specifically going to allow us to continue to do so. The problem is, it's not whether or not it's going to exist in both worlds. What we're saying is that right now, presidents are using the AUMF as their justification for drone strikes. That's specifically a power granted by the AUMF, therefore it's bad. They don't contest the impacts here. But let's go on to to the one that they do on civilian lives, right? They try to tell you right now the link is 1.5%.
The problem here, their card, it says that the estimate of one group is 1.5%. Furthermore, they don't. It's like for Pakistan, it's a specific country. It doesn't tie back to all United States strikes. Move on to where they try to talk to you about decapitation, right? The problem behind the GMU card is it gives you this like 27% failure rate in like 2010. The problem behind the authors behind this are that they have been switching on their views for multiple years now. There's no general consensus between the entire scientific community that decapitation works. Make them show you a broad-based, multiple studies from different authors tell you the same thing. They're not going to be able to show you that. But let's go on to the third point, right? Where they try to tell you that coalition is currently working with us. That's the point. We want the coalition to continue working with us. If we want that, we need to keep their populations happy. At the point where Pakistan and other countries where we've been using drones have been complaining to us specifically about our drone usage, we're going to see this coalition fall apart if we continue to do so brazenly with the AUMF. With solvency is to pull out through our contention too. We tell you through diplomacy, this is the only solvency, right? Their point here is that like this diplomacy is not good because it's going to push them to the political sphere, right? But what Gettner just directly tells you is that when you pull the United States out of these volatile areas, their main policies about anti-American sentiments and these like radical thoughts eventually dissipate over time, which means that over time we're decreasing radicalization, we're decreasing terrorism. That's the only solvency that you see in this round.
Is everyone ready? You say our author on drone strike decapitation is unsure about himself. So
not necessarily. What I'm saying is that like,
I know,
in general,
like,
society is unsure about decapitation.
Well, if our author is sure, why does that matter? That society is
so you're
unsure.
showing me like one study, right? So like,
Yeah.
like these authors like Jenna Jordan, Johnson,
Wait, who is my author if
I'm
you're
not,
so
I'm not
sure
saying,
he's
like,
unsure?
Okay, it's not one specific author. I'm saying the entire scientific community
According
on
to who?
decapitation doesn't have
According
consensus.
to, you didn't cite a card for that. That's just something you said.
Johnson and Jenna Jordan specifically tell you, like in another case, like, oh, our previous studies are not true, and they've been publishing new studies.
So
like,
one
every
guy
4
messed
years
up a
split
study.
topic.
Why does that mean our study is incorrect?
I'm saying that the general, like, I can show
One
you
dude
cards
messed up a
showing
study
you
means the
people.
general consensus is gone?
No, there's also cards telling you that the general scientific
Well,
community
you
has
didn't
no
cite that, but
consensus.
we'd like to hear those in summary, but
Sure.
you can take your question.
Sure. So let's go on to like your main point here is that you're going to solve specifically for like the Iraqi war and like
Yeah.
ISIS specifically, right?
Yeah.
So what about like the other 10 countries we've intervened in, i.e. like the AUMF? What specifically
We
is
would
like,
say
active in there?
those interventions are not unique because Congress would have approved them anyway. However, Congress does not plan to fight ISIS. We tell you the reason why is because it is unpopular to go back into Iraq after our last failed invasion.
Wait. So like what's specific to like Iraq as a location? Like why
What's
specifically?
specific? We had
is
the
Congress not willing to
2002
go there?
intervention
Sure.
against there that
But, like,
everyone hated. That's
so-
why the Atlantic evidence, which you cold drop in your rebuttal, says Congressmen don't want to take a stance on the ISIS issue because they worry it is too controversial and it could ruin their popularity.
So is it the ISIS issue or the Iraq issue? I
It's
wanna
the
know if
Iraq
it's
issue.
location. So it's location.
Iraq, ISIS, which is in Iraq, so the two are connected.
Sure. So then why would Congress still fund the president's AUMF ventures?
There's a difference between being complicit in an intervention and being responsible for one. We're saying Congress doesn't want to take responsibility because they could get voted out. The way congressional campaigns work is people say, look, this congressman voted for this bill which harmed you as a citizen, you shouldn't vote for him. Simply being complicit is a different story altogether.
So if United States popularity for intervention against ISIS is above 50%, what's the
It's
chance
not
of it
above
being
50%.
I show you through the Hill. The Hill in 2017 finds that the U.S. population wants an intervention against ISIS.
Okay, well the issue is that many Americans want an intervention at first. However, as the intervention progresses, like we saw with Iraq, Vietnam, and basically every other intervention, America grows tired with it, and then we see politicians
So then
get
why
punished.
are we like, why is Congress approving these other interventions in the other 10
Because
countries
we
talk about?
because who has heard about the intervention in Somalia on TV? Like
I
that's
mean-
much more uncommon for an American to be
So
considered
if you're
an issue they
contesting that,
vote
like,
on.
if you're contesting that all like interventions eventually
No.
go sour, so why are these 10 like somehow different?
They're not somehow different. They're just less popular and less well known.
So
So I'd
then
like
why
to ask
won't
you a
they gain
question.
popularity? Sure,
So
go ahead.
you say that since the AUMF, like you read an overview that says even though the president would be doing drone strikes anyway, since the AUMF grants him that power, it's bad.
Yes.
If this doesn't actually increase the president's power, why is it too much power?
Okay, so what we're not looking at is whether or not the AUMF increased power from something before. It's whether or not the AUMF
Wait,
comes
the
with
definition of
ability
too
to
much
use-
power means that you're getting more power. If you had the same power before, that is not too much
No,
power.
It's whether
That's
or not
the same
with
power.
the AUMF in place, the amount of power you're granted with the AUMF is too much.
But the
or
amount of
not.
power hasn't changed.
When James sits down, we're going to so that's
We'll start now.
Okay.
52 seconds.
Overview, their case, our case.
Where do you want to do this?
It's just the framework that they read, so just in response to whatever they read. Is everybody ready? On the overview debate, they just say that if the AUMF authorized something, that means that it's got to be bad. But we say that if it's also authorized under the text of a different bill, then the non-unique still applies because it's not too much power if they still have the same amount of power as before. Then, onto their case. We read a couple of responses that they try to frontline. The first one is the idea that the GMU says that leadership decapitation is the new strategy for drone strikes, which is why only 1.5% of civilians are dying, and these groups are 27% more likely to fail. The one response we get here is like, other studies messed up, so our study must be bad too. That absolutely makes no sense. Our study is conducted by 3 of the most respected journals. I would say it's a pretty good piece of evidence. Then they say that then they say that Pakistan doesn't like our drone strikes. There's no tangible impact to that because Pakistan's still part of our coalition and they're still cooperating. Then they say that we're going to be laying that when you have cooperation with terrorist groups and they have diplomacy, that's going to be less conflict. But we say that when terrorist groups become a political party and win the next election, that makes them even worse because it gives them the legitimacy of an actual government and allows them to magnify the amount of crimes that they're doing. And then we tell you under the War Powers Act that overall these interventions on drone strikes are going to happen in either world. But when you have a 60-day limit the War Powers Act establishes, you only have short-term interventions, which leads power vacuums, which leads to the rise of groups like ISIS. With that, let's go to ISIS. Group all 3 of the responses where they say that Congress is going to be complicit anyways. They drop the Atlantic evidence, which indicates that that complicit is different than responsible. Congress doesn't want to explicitly authorize an intervention because they don't want to be explicitly politically tied to the intervention in Iraq because it's not going to be popular. They say that the people like it, but the people often like wars at first, but they overall war enthusiasm falls rapidly as the war progresses. So overall, that's why Congress doesn't want to be tied to it. The impacts here go conceded. The first one is on logistical support, where we tell you from the Institute of Strategic Studies that the U.S. troop presence in Iraq leads troop training and logistical support. How do we know that works? In 2011, when we pulled out, the front collapsed and ISIS rose. Second, on airstrikes, the University of Glasgow tells you that 98% of the land that ISIS holds was lost because of the airstrike. We would tell you that's a very good indicator of airstrikes working, and we would tell you that's a very good reason for you to negate.
Okay, just gonna go framework, their case, our case. Start out with framework. They tell you that it's correlative, not causation, when we're telling you that the intervention has caused these terrorist groups to rise. But we tell you that 95% of the retaliatory attacks are a result of intervention. More specifically, they say we can't pull ISIS, but more importantly, when Osama bin Laden first saw the U.S. intervene, this was a call to arms for everyone. He said, everyone look, the West is invading, they're fighting against Islam, this is the chance we rise up. That's how recruitment's going to be increasing. More importantly, we see you can turn the whole point about intervention, because intervention is actually how people radicalize. Because if there's a peaceful citizen in the area, they're not going to be radicalizing if we see something just take out someone who's bad. But if there's military troops in the area, that's how peaceful civilians are going to be radicalizing. That's how you're going to be seeing more recruitment. That being said, they all try to talk about the appellate court. The key thing here, that was really on Guantanamo, not AUMF. They're basically lying on that point. Then also they talk about how it's legal through Congress, but Congress passes laws all the time that are unconstitutional. It hasn't been viewed on the Supreme Court yet. Don't let them extend this. More importantly, they say that it's non-unique. Every time they say it's non-unique, you're voting for us. Because if they're saying it's non-unique, they're conceding that it's happening bad in their world as well as in our world. And they're also conceding that it's happening under the AUMF. To that degree, you are voting for us because it is giving the president too much power if it's happening in either world. That being said, they keep talking about 1.5% civilians in terms of drones. It's like it's only killing 1.5% of drones. This is only in terms of Pakistan. It's a really small scope. If you look at the entire Middle East, you're going to be looking to our cards, which James conveniently drops, talking about a 35 times more civilian death ratio, and 98% of those drone strikes overall are going to be killing civilians. That's how you're voting for us. Because when you're killing civilians, recruitment increases. That is how the perpetual war on terror keeps going on in the pro world. Because all they do is they kill one group, then another group springs up, they kill another group, another group springs up, and in that time, there's more and more recruitment. They keep saying they're taking out leaders, and that's good. But keep in mind the Hydra effect. One leader falls out, another one takes his place. In any world for a pro ballot, it's just a continuation of war. Then they try to extend this thing here. They say, like, Quran is like a religious war. Like, they say they're invincible, and we have to break that myth. According to them, that myth has already been broken when they took 98% of the land. So we'd already be seeing the effects in their world. Since we're not, you're going to be voting for the pro. Because they say about, like, getting rid of this myth, it hasn't been working for the past 2 decades. Don't vote for a policy that is just a continuation of perpetual war that is unconstitutional because the president shouldn't be doing it in the first place. Is everybody ready?
If your bad impacts happen even when we vote for you, why should we vote for you?
Right. Okay, so the key thing here is the resolution says that the AUMF gives too much power to the president, right? So if it's giving too much power to the president with or without the AUMF, it's still giving too much power to the president.
No, the issue is
that means
the
that
AUMF isn't granting power. Right. The AUMF isn't
really forcing the amount of
wait,
power
so
that's
you're saying
already
that 2
there.
laws can't give someone too much power?
We're saying,
we can talk about
like,
the war powers
hold on,
resolution, whether
on
it gives
the
someone
base-
else power.
on the
But if both
basis
give too
of
much
the war-
power, that's a different argument. We can talk about repealing a different law, but that's not what we're doing.
No,
We're talking about the power
basis-
You have to prove that AUMF uniquely gives the president new powers he didn't have. Otherwise, he isn't being given too much power.
I didn't see uniquely given in the resolution. I thought it just gives the president too much power.
Yeah.
Not that it's the only law that gives the
Wait,
president
AF
too
has
much
to
power.
prove
On the
uniqueness.
basis-
That's how debate
I
works. You
agree
have to prove you have
that's not what
unique
I'm saying.
benefits and unique
I'm
powers.
saying more specifically within the AUMF in terms of the resolution. It just says that the
so let's do
types
the-
of
let's do the
talking
simple
really
thing.
quickly
Wait,
that you're not
saying
listening
it
to
says
what
the
we're saying.
AUMF gives the president too much power. Not that it's the only piece of legislation that gives the president
So
too
let's
much power.
pause.
We're not
and
looking at the
let's
legislation.
pause and do the simplest weighing analysis in the world.
Sure.
If your case happens, no matter who you vote for, if we access an ounce of our offense, do we win the round?
No, because you don't. But more importantly, let's move on. Let's move
More
on.
important is about why.
Because
This logically
you guys-
doesn't make
this
sense.
is your question.
You guys can't prove
This is
your
your question.
question. Don't
Can I
agree.
ask my question with the word if? You can't just be like, no,
Well,
not if.
Well, you guys asked 2 questions now. Can I ask one?
Sure.
Okay. So
Well, you didn't respond to either of them.
But
You
it's
can't
fine.
ask.
you just didn't like my response. But more importantly, let's move on to this 1.5. Is 1.5%, specifically in Pakistan with a small scope, indicative of all drone strikes throughout the Middle East?
It's about the shift in strategy, right? So
How
we're
so?
saying your study is also really flawed because the data set is super old. The issue is that
Okay.
we've begun a new strategy, specifically targeting leaders, not just any random terrorists.
We have begun a new strategy, but Savage tells you it's even worse because we pulled back regulations which you don't respond to. This new
Wait,
strategy
no.
is even
No,
worse.
that's
Regulations-
one
So if you're
part of
saying
the
that
new
if you're saying
strategy.
that drones are bad in the past,
Regulations-
and now we have less restrictions on them in the future,
Hold
you're
on.
voting pro.
Regulations aren't the reason that we have military strategies.
I agree.
Congress determines regulations. They're not the reason that we have military decapitations. The reason we have military decapitations is because the DoD and the Pentagon see that they work. So it doesn't matter whether or not Congress repeals the regulation or
That's
not.
clearly not what I'm
It's
saying.
the matter of whether or not the military thinks they work, so they're going to conduct them anyways.
But you're also not responding to the Hydra effect, but that's also not what I'm saying.
The Hydra effect was
Right.
brand new in
We
summer,
literally-
but
I
even
also
then, the
preempted
analysis
what
that
I
we
told
give you
you.
is holistic
Okay.
and says that when you have leadership decapitation from the GMU,
Okay.
the group rate failure of terrorist groups increased by 27%.
Give me an example.
That's holistic.
Give me an example.
ISIS, which has lost 20,000 members,
Really,
and is
they're
at its
done now?
lowest
They're
members.
done.
I
They're
mean,
not
they've
done,
lost
which is why we need to
98%
stay.
of their
But
land,
in
like we
2
need to
decades,
stay.
in 2 decades, what have we done?
What do you mean?
We
In
haven't-
2 decades,
we
how
haven't
what?
fought ISIS
In
for
2
brought
decades,
ISIS to
yes,
its
well, like from
knees.
2001 to 2018.
We
I'm
have
rounding
not
here.
fought ISIS
I'm
in
rounding here.
2001.
I know, but I'm talking about like all
We
terror.
fought
I'm
ISIS
rounding
for
here.
a few years
fought
ago.
ISIS
So we
for
fought
4
Al Qaeda
years,
and we
that's a
got
bad
ISIS. We
rounding.
fight ISIS, we get someone else. Perpetual war is a definition
No, it's
of the
perpetual
case.
war if we pull out too early. We'll start running crap. everyone ready? Let's start on their case. First, starting on drones, they cold drop the evidence that we see a 27% increase in the group rate failure. They simply say our statistic is bad without a logical warrant. Logically, if you take out the leader of the group, the guy who runs logistics, they are more likely to fail. They say somebody's going to replace them. The person that replaces them doesn't have as much logistical know-how. That's why these groups fail more often. Then, second of all, on diplomacy. We tell you when terrorists and radicals get absorbed into government, it's a really bad thing. For example, we see Hamas, and we see like the Nazis getting absorbed into government. That's fundamentally bad. When you turn ideology into government, we see mass genocide is the result. We would say, if anything, their form of diplomacy only empowers terrorists. We shouldn't be negotiating with these terrorists. At that level, let's go to our case. We tell you, the entirety of their case is non-unique because under the War Powers Act, all of it is still going to be occurring. They're saying, simply because the AUMF justifies some of it, it's too much power? No. If you repealed the AUMF, we would still have the War Power Act, which gives the same amount of power. The AUMF is not a unique increase in power. All of their drone strikes still occur. However, what does this mean? The War Powers Act allows 60-day interventions. Like Brian tells you, this is a really bad thing because we only see half-baked interventions coming in their world. That's a turn on their entire case that goes drop the entire round. We see these short-term interventions. So when my opponents talk about the Hydra effect and the power vacuum and how each group of terrorists is created after the last, the reason why this has been occurring is because we have been leaving too early, a problem which only worsens in their world. This was literally the reason why ISIS was created. So how do we solve? We solve in two ways. First, logistically. We tell you when we left the front in 2011, the entire front collapsed. Consequently, ISIS research in 2014. It's the idea of short-term intervention leading to long-term implications. We tell you we need to stay in there for a long time. The only way is with an authorization of force. But then second of all is on airstrikes. They've claimed time and time again we haven't actually been fighting and effectively reducing their power. Yes, we have. They've lost 98% of their land, 20,000 militants. So consequently, we can say that ISIS is at its knees. It's not a question of whether or not we've done a good job. It's the fact that if we pull out now, ISIS will resurge like it did in 2014, which is why we uniquely cannot end the authorization right now, and we must maintain stability and negate the resolution.
Okay, we have 37 seconds left, I think. So we're going to have some.
What game is that? What game is that? What? What? Who? What? What? Gonzaga's up 15-0.
Very much like so we're looking at whether or not the AUMF grants powers that are more over the top or not. It doesn't matter if another law also grants the same powers. If the president is using the AUMF to justify his current actions, that's a power granted by the AUMF. At that point, you wade through to our side. But start with their point, right? Their entire case circulates around the fact that we're going to intervene in like Iraq. And then they try to claim that when we don't intervene, it's going to cause a problem with ISIS resurgence, right? The problem here is that we claim we can solve that through diplomacy. We don't want intervention in the first place because they clean drop where we tell you 95% of all suicide terrorism throughout the world since 2001 has been caused by intervention in the first place. So go back to our case. Start off top with constitutionality, which we completely ignore. At the point where the Supreme Court has never approved the constitutionality of the AUMF, they can't claim that the power is justified at the point where it's never been. But then, move on. Start with drones, right? Their point here is that like the kill rate of civilians is extremely low now, but they don't respond to the fact that that's specifically to only Pakistan. At the point where overall we see drones killing thousands of civilians, and we see them using that as a propaganda method to increase recruitment, we're going to see the impacts surge. But what they try to tell you is this is a capitation card of 27%. They just ignore the Hydra effect, where we tell you, Jordan, other sources, 2009 and 2017, all find that when you have a decapitation, you only see a fragmentation of the groups into smaller groups, which then last longer. So while the large group sure has gone away, as they tell you, we see that terrorism goes up. That's the point, and that's what you have to wade through on the round. but go on finally to diplomacy. Because when you don't have intervention in our world, we show you that we have a 43% chance of solvency, right? They're going to come up here and tell you that this political system problem is inherently bad. But a study from Jetner, which we read you in case and we have extended throughout the entire round, tells you that for like 648 cases over the last 50 years have gone through the system, right? We haven't seen like massive political parties come out and start genocides realistically over like that long period of time. The majority of these terrorist groups go away peacefully, and it's better solvency than having to fight them through war and losing American lives in that process. We give you the solvency data.
You're on, guys.
You're on.
Guess what? That's how I did 39. My body's broken. I don't think I have blood. I usually go on.